welcome back, and thank you for choosing to unwind with this peaceful moment of reflection. Take a deep breath, letting go of any tension in your body, and find a comfortable position to settle into. As you close your eyes, picture yourself in a quiet, serene place. Feel the warmth of the gentle light, the soft flicker of the firelight, and the calming sound of the crackling fire in the background. Let the noise fade into the distance as you focus on the stillness around you. With every breath you take, feel your body relax even more deeply, melting into the calm of this moment. Tonight, we embark on a journey of faith and courage, a story that has been told for generations. It's a tale that echoes with the triumph of belief and the power of overcoming overwhelming odds. A story where a young shepherd, unassuming and humble, takes on a challenge far greater than anyone could have imagined. As you listen to the story, let your mind open to the lessons of bravery, trust, and the unwavering strength that comes when we stand firm in our faith. Allow yourself to be transported to the fields of ancient Israel, where this story began, as we reflect on the powerful journey of David and Goliath. In the stillness, remember to breathe deeply. Inhale the peace around you and exhale any lingering thoughts. You are safe here in this moment, ready to take in this timeless story of courage and faith. In the ancient world, Israel was a small but resilient nation, constantly under the shadow of powerful neighbors. The Israelites were descendants of the great patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who had been promised by God to inherit the land of Canaan. But as time went on, the land of Israel was not as peaceful as the early promises had foretold. The Israelites had come a long way from their time in Egypt, where they had been enslaved for generations. Under the leadership of Moses and later Joshua, they had entered the promised land. Yet, despite their triumphs, the Israelites faced continual battles to secure their territory. The land of Canaan was not empty, and the Israelites found themselves at odds with various powerful nations. One of the greatest threats to Israel was the Philistines. The Philistines were a seafaring people who had settled along the coastal plains of Canaan, and they were known for their military strength and advanced weaponry. Unlike the Israelites, who were often armed with rudimentary tools and weapons, the Philistines had mastered ironworking, giving them a significant advantage in battle. The Philistines were not just another enemy to be fought, they were a formidable force that would not be easily defeated. Their army was large, well-equipped, and battle-hardened. They had established 5 major cities along the coast: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. It was from Gath that Goliath, the giant warrior, hailed. At the time of the David and Goliath story, the Israelites were led by King Saul, the first king of Israel. Saul had been anointed by the prophet Samuel, and although he had experienced victories in battle, his reign was not without its challenges. The Israelites were struggling with disunity and fear. Their army, though brave, was often outmatched by the might of the Philistines, and morale was low. Goliath's challenge came at a time when the Israelites were particularly vulnerable. The battle between the two armies took place in the valley of Elah, a strategic location between the two opposing forces. The valley, with its steep hills and rocky terrain, provided a natural setting for the confrontation. The Israelite army was stationed on one hill, and the Philistine army was positioned on the opposite side. For 40 days, Goliath had stood in the valley, calling out to the Israelites to send forth a warrior to fight him in single combat. The challenge was more than just a battle between two men. It was a battle for the honor of their nations, a test of faith, and a confrontation that would decide the fate of Israel. The Israelites were terrified. No one had the courage to face Goliath. His presence alone was enough to send chills down the spine of any soldier. Goliath's towering stature, his terrifying appearance, and his boisterous insults made him a figure of dread. Standing at over 9 feet tall, Goliath was an imposing figure, clad in heavy armor that shimmered in the sunlight. His bronze helmet glinted like a beacon, and his chest was protected by a coat of armor that weighed over 125 pounds. His spear was like a massive tree branch, the iron point glinting in the sunlight. He was a weapon of war, a living embodiment of fear and strength. For 40 days he taunted the Israelites, daring them to send someone to face him. His challenge was clear. Choose a man and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us. The echo of his words resounded through the camp, sending shock waves of fear through the hearts of the Israelite soldiers. The longer the challenge went unanswered, the more the Israelites began to lose hope. Each day that passed without a response from their army was another day of shame, another day of disgrace. Their courage was slowly being drained, and their belief in their own ability to win seemed to fade. But it was in the midst of this fear and hopelessness that a young shepherd named David entered the camp. David was not a soldier. He was the youngest of 8 brothers and had been sent by his father to deliver food to the front lines. He was not concerned with the war or the fear that gripped the army. He was concerned with something much more important, the honor of God's name. When David arrived and heard Goliath's taunts, something stirred deep within him. He was not afraid of Goliath. He could not understand why no one had stood up to this giant. To David, this wasn't just a battle between 2 armies. It was a spiritual battle, a battle to protect the honor of the living God. David's faith would soon be put to the ultimate test. But before we dive into his incredible courage and decision to face Goliath, let's pause and reflect on the setting. The stage had been set for a dramatic clash between the forces of good and evil, between faith and fear, between a young shepherd and a mighty giant. As David stood on the edge of the Israelite camp, the sight of Goliath was enough to send shivers down the spine of any man. But for David, it was something more, something personal. To him, this was not just a battle of flesh and blood. It was a battle for the honor of God. As the mighty Philistine giant stepped forward, David's heart did not falter. Goliath's towering frame, clad in gleaming bronze armor, was a daunting sight. The giant's presence alone seemed to cast a shadow over the entire battlefield. For 40 days, Goliath had emerged each morning to mock the Israelites, his thunderous voice carrying over the hills. He was a mountain of a man, and his insults were as massive as his stature. Goliath's challenge was simple. He demanded that the Israelites send out their best warrior to face him in single combat. If he was victorious, the Israelites would become the Philistine servants. But if their champion triumphed, the Philistines would serve the Israelites. Goliath's words were filled with disdain, an arrogance that made the earth beneath him tremble. His challenge was not just to a man, it was an affront to God himself. The giant scoffed at the Israelites' God, mocking the very foundation of their faith. "Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me," he bellowed. His voice echoed across the valley, and with each word the Israelites cowered in fear. The sight of this giant was unlike any other that the Israelites had ever faced. Goliath's armor alone was a masterpiece of military engineering. His bronze helmet, shield, and coat of mail were so finely crafted that they seemed to glow under the midday sun. His weighty armor was a testament to his strength, a constant reminder of his prowess as a warrior. But it was not just his armor that struck fear into the hearts of the Israelites. It was his size. Goliath stood over 9 feet tall, nearly double the height of the average Israelite soldier. His massive limbs were like tree trunks, and his muscles bulged with raw power. His voice, deep and thunderous, made the earth shake as he boasted of his might. The giant seemed invincible, an unstoppable force. His presence alone was enough to make the strongest of men quiver in fear. His challenge seemed impossible to ignore. He taunted the Israelites daily, daring them to face him, and with each passing day, the fear grew. As the days dragged on and no one took up Goliath's challenge, the morale of the Israelite army began to plummet. Saul, their king, had no answer. His soldiers were paralyzed with fear. The mighty Goliath stood there mocking God and the people of Israel, yet no one could find the courage to stand against him. The Israelites were trapped in a cycle of shame and fear, uncertain of how to move forward. David, however, was different. As the youngest of 8 brothers, David had been sent to the front lines by his father Jesse to deliver food and check on the welfare of his brothers. When David arrived at the camp, he was not initially concerned with the battle. He was a shepherd by trade, accustomed to tending sheep in the hills and valleys. But when David saw Goliath, something within him stirred. He was shocked by the fear that gripped the army of Israel. Why were they not rising up against this blasphemer? Why were they not standing up for the name of God? David's heart burned with righteous indignation. The giant's mocking words were an insult not only to Israel, but to the living God. David knew that God had always been faithful to his people, and he would not abandon them now. Despite Goliath's formidable size and strength, David saw an opportunity to show the power of God in the face of overwhelming odds. David's boldness was not born out of arrogance, nor was it a rash desire for fame. It was born out of his deep faith in God. He had spent years protecting his father's flock from lions and bears, and in those quiet moments in the wilderness, he had learned to trust in the Lord's protection. He had seen God's deliverance in his own life and knew that God would be with him now. "The Lord, who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear, will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine," David declared to King Saul, who was initially skeptical of the young shepherd's ability to face such a fearsome opponent. David was not deterred. He had witnessed God's faithfulness in small battles, and he believed that God would empower him to face this giant. His faith was unwavering, his courage unshaken. David did not see Goliath as an unbeatable foe. He saw him as an obstacle that stood in the way of God's victory. When David volunteered to fight Goliath, Saul hesitated, unsure of how this young shepherd could take on a trained warrior. But David insisted, and in the end Saul relented. "Go, and the Lord be with you," Saul said, though it was clear that he was doubtful of David's chances. With the king's blessing, David prepared for battle. But instead of wearing the heavy armor offered to him, David chose to fight with only his sling and 5 smooth stones from a nearby brook. It was an unconventional choice. Most warriors would never dream of going into battle without proper armor and weapons. But David's trust was not in armor or weapons. His trust was in God alone. As David walked toward the battlefield, Goliath sneered in disbelief. The giant's mockery intensified when he saw the young shepherd armed only with a sling. "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" Goliath roared. But David's resolve did not falter. "You come against me with sword and spear, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied," David declared. David's words rang out across the valley, and the tension in the air was palpable. The stage was set for the most iconic battle in history. The battle between a boy with faith and a giant who had no faith in anything but his own strength. As the Israelites watched from the sidelines, David's preparation was unlike anything they had ever seen before. While the army had been paralyzed by fear, David moved with purpose, his focus unwavering. The young shepherd had already decided he would face Goliath. He had seen the giant's blasphemy and knew it was his calling to step into the gap and defend the name of the Lord. But before the battle, David had to prepare not with the traditional armor of a warrior, but with something far more powerful, his faith. David's decision was not a spur-of-the-moment impulse. It was rooted deeply in his years of experience as a shepherd. He had spent countless hours in the fields protecting his sheep from wild animals like lions and bears. In those solitary moments, David had learned the art of trusting God for protection and strength. When a lion or bear attacked, David didn't rely on his own strength or skill to defeat the predator. Instead, he relied on God's intervention. "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine," he said with complete confidence. 1 Samuel 17:37. This faith was David's greatest weapon, his unwavering belief that God would protect him in the face of danger. It was not a passive faith, but an active one. It was a faith that had been honed in the quiet moments of his youth, when he had fought off wild beasts to protect his father's flock. It was a faith that had been tested and proven time and time again, long before David ever faced the giant Goliath. When Saul heard David's declaration of faith, he was initially skeptical. The king was a man of war, accustomed to the weapons of battle, and he couldn't understand how a young shepherd boy could take on such a formidable opponent. Saul, however, recognized something in David's words, something he himself had lost, a steadfast trust in God. Saul had been paralyzed by fear for 40 days, unable to act. But David, with his youthful zeal and trust in the Lord, seemed to have a courage that no armor could provide. David was not swayed by Saul's doubts or by the taunts of others. He had spent his life fighting battles on behalf of his family and his God, and now he was ready for the greatest battle of all. As he prepared to face Goliath, David chose to wear no armor at all. The king offered him his own armor, heavy bronze armor, and a helmet designed to protect a warrior in combat. But David knew that this armor would be a hindrance, not a help. It was foreign to him, a tool of the skilled warrior. David had never fought wearing armor, and he knew that it would only slow him down. Instead, David chose the simplest and most humble of weapons, a sling and 5 smooth stones from a nearby brook. To the Israelites, this choice might have seemed ridiculous. How could a boy with a sling hope to defeat a towering giant, a seasoned warrior who wielded a sword, spear, and shield? But to David, it was a clear decision. His strength did not lie in the physical weapons of man, but in the power of God. The sling was not a common weapon for battle in the ancient world, yet it was one that had served David well in his time as a shepherd. With it, he had protected his flock from wild animals, striking down beasts with the single, well-aimed stone. It was an extension of his skill and experience, a tool he had mastered over the years. The sling was David's weapon of choice, not because it was a conventional weapon, but because it was the one that aligned with his faith and his experience. As David approached the battlefield, he was met with ridicule. Goliath, towering above him and clad in his heavy armor, could not fathom why the Israelites would send a boy to face him. When David stepped forward with only a sling in hand, the giant mocked him, calling him a mere child, a dog to be defeated easily. "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" Goliath roared, his voice filled with disdain. But David stood firm. He had no need for the mocking words of his enemy. His confidence did not come from the weight of armor or the sharpness of weapons. It came from the Almighty God, the creator of the heavens and the earth. David's response to Goliath's insults was simple but profound. "You come against me with sword and spear, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." 1 Samuel 17:45. This statement was not just a declaration of David's courage, it was a statement of divine authority. David was not simply fighting for his people, he was fighting for the honor and glory of God. Goliath had defied the living God, and David could not allow that to go unchallenged. David's preparation, both spiritual and physical, had been built over years of trusting in God's power. While the Israelite army had placed their hope in their weapons, David placed his hope in God. His preparation had not been about mastering the art of battle in the traditional sense. It had been about cultivating a heart that trusted God completely, knowing that God would fight for him. With his sling in hand and his faith firmly grounded, David stood ready to face the giant. The armies of Israel watched in stunned silence as the young shepherd boy, armed only with his simple weapon and his unwavering faith, prepared to do what seemed impossible. David knew that the battle was not his alone, it was God's battle. And with God on his side, nothing could stand in his way. The battle between David and Goliath is one of the most iconic and profound moments in the entire Bible. It is a story that has resonated through generations as a symbol of courage, faith, and divine intervention. As the two opponents faced each other, the tension in the air was palpable. On one side stood the mighty Goliath, towering and armored, a giant who had terrified the Israelites for days. On the other stood David, a young shepherd with nothing but a sling, 5 smooth stones, and an unwavering trust in the power of God. The scene was set for an epic confrontation, one that would have seemed impossible to any onlooker. Goliath, accustomed to victory in battle, could not fathom how a boy like David could pose any real threat to him. His giant form, clad in heavy armor and carrying a spear like a weaver's beam, was a picture of invincibility. His voice boomed across the battlefield as he cursed the Israelites and mocked their God. With every word he spoke, he sought to intimidate, to break the spirit of David, and to prove that no one could stand against him. Yet, despite the overwhelming odds, David was undeterred. The young shepherd boy was not intimidated by Goliath's size, strength, or insults. Instead, he stood firm, confident not in his own abilities, but in the power of the God he served. As Goliath drew near, David took a step forward, his eyes fixed on the giant before him. He had no intention of meeting Goliath's mocking words with insults or taunts of his own. Instead, David focused on the God he knew would deliver him from this foe. As Goliath approached, David reached into his pouch and selected one of the 5 smooth stones he had gathered from the stream. With a practiced hand, he placed the stone in his sling. The sound of the stone spinning through the air was the only noise that broke the heavy silence. The Israelite army watched in awe as David took aim, his faith unwavering, his trust in God absolute. There was no hesitation in his movements, only a deep sense of purpose and divine confidence. In that moment, the battle became not one of physical strength, but of spiritual warfare. David was not fighting for personal glory or honor. He was fighting to defend the name of the Lord and to uphold his honor before all of Israel. Goliath's taunts were not just directed at David. They were directed at God himself. And David knew that this was a battle he could not lose because it was not his to fight alone. With a swift motion, David released the stone from his sling. The projectile flew through the air with incredible speed and accuracy, striking Goliath in the forehead. The force of the blow was enough to cause the giant to stumble and fall. Time seemed to stand still as the armies of Israel and the Philistines watched in astonishment. Goliath, the undefeated warrior, lay motionless on the ground, his massive body crumpled by the stone that had been propelled by a boy's sling. For a moment, there was silence. The Philistine army, which had boasted of their invincibility, was in shock. The Israelite army, which had been paralyzed by fear, now stood in stunned amazement at the miraculous turn of events. The victory, which had seemed impossible just moments before, was now a reality. David, with nothing but a sling and faith in God, had defeated the giant. But the victory did not stop there. David, knowing that the battle was not yet complete, ran to Goliath's fallen body. He took Goliath's own sword, an enormous weapon that no ordinary man could wield, and used it to cut off the giant's head. With this final act, David solidified his victory and ensured that the Philistine army would be utterly defeated. The head of Goliath, once a symbol of fear and intimidation, was now a trophy of victory, a testimony to the power of God and the courage of the young shepherd. As David stood over Goliath's fallen body, the Philistine army began to retreat in panic. Their champion had been defeated, and with him, their morale had been shattered. The Israelites, seeing the giant's head held high, surged forward with renewed strength and courage. The victory over Goliath was not just a personal triumph for David, it was a victory for all of Israel. It was a victory that demonstrated that no enemy, no matter how great or mighty, could stand against the power of God. In that moment, David's victory became a defining moment for Israel. It was a moment that would go down in history as a testament to the power of faith and courage. David, though young and untested in battle, had proven that it was not the size of the warrior, but the strength of their faith that determined the outcome of the battle. The story of David and Goliath would forever be remembered as a shining example of how God can take the humble and the weak and make them strong in His service. The victory over Goliath was a pivotal moment in David's life and in the history of Israel. It marked the beginning of David's rise to prominence, not just as a warrior, but as a future king. But more importantly, it was a victory that demonstrated the incredible power of faith and the unwavering trust in God's ability to deliver His people from their enemies. David's faith had been tested, and he had emerged victorious, proving that with God on his side, no challenge was too great to overcome. The aftermath of David's stunning victory over Goliath was far-reaching, both for the Israelite nation and for David personally. The battle, which had been seen as a mere skirmish, turned into a monumental turning point in the history of Israel. It was a victory that instilled courage in the hearts of the Israelites and struck fear into the hearts of their enemies. But beyond the immediate triumph, the story of David and Goliath carries profound lessons that transcend time and speak to the heart of every believer. As David stood victorious, the effects of his triumph rippled through the camp of Israel. The soldiers who had once cowered in fear at the sight of Goliath now felt emboldened by the young shepherd's bravery. Their confidence was restored, and the sight of their enemy's champion lying defeated at David's feet spurred them into action. The Israelites, once paralyzed by the presence of the giant, now charged forward with newfound vigor, and the Philistine army, demoralized by the loss of their greatest warrior, quickly turned and fled. David's victory was not just a military triumph, it was a spiritual one. By trusting in God, David had defied all expectations and defeated the giant. His victory demonstrated that God's power is not bound by human limitations or circumstances. While Goliath was a seasoned warrior with years of battle experience, David was just a young shepherd, untested in war. But David's faith in God's ability to deliver him was the key to his victory. His courage was not rooted in his own strength, but in the assurance that God would fight for him. David's victory also served as a powerful reminder of the importance of trusting in God's timing and plan. When David was chosen to be anointed king of Israel, he was not immediately thrust into leadership or battle. Instead, he spent years tending to sheep, preparing for the day when God would call him to fulfill his destiny. His victory over Goliath was not just a random event. It was the culmination of years of preparation and trust in God's guidance. David's time in the fields, alone with God, had shaped his faith and built his character. And when the moment of battle came, he was ready. In the aftermath of the battle, the Israelites celebrated David's victory. The people sang songs of praise, and David's fame spread throughout the land. King Saul, who had previously been reluctant to acknowledge David's abilities, now took notice of the young shepherd's courage and strength. Saul invited David to serve in his court, and David's position within the kingdom began to rise. But David's humility remained intact. He did not allow his newfound fame to cloud his judgment or lead him to arrogance. Instead, he remained focused on God's calling and purpose for his life. For Saul, however, the victory over Goliath would mark the beginning of a decline. Though Saul had once been Israel's mighty king, his jealousy and insecurity would soon begin to take hold. As David's popularity grew, Saul's fear and envy grew alongside it. The very man who had once celebrated David's bravery now saw him as a threat to his throne. But despite the growing tension between David and Saul, David continued to trust in God's plan for his life. Even when Saul sought to harm him, David remained faithful to God and refused to take matters into his own hands. He knew that God's timing and purposes would prevail, no matter the circumstances. The victory over Goliath also had a lasting impact on the Philistine people. Their champion had fallen, and their morale had been shattered. The Israelites, emboldened by David's bravery, pursued the fleeing Philistines, and the battle was decisively won. The victory was not just a personal one for David, it was a victory for all of Israel. The defeat of Goliath sent a powerful message to the surrounding nations that the God of Israel was a mighty and powerful God, capable of delivering his people from even the most fearsome of foes. But beyond the immediate effects of the battle, David's victory over Goliath carries profound spiritual lessons. The story serves as a reminder that faith in God is the key to overcoming life's giants, those seemingly insurmountable obstacles that we face in our lives. Whether it's fear, doubt, or adversity, we can be assured that God is with us, fighting on our behalf. Just as David faced Goliath with courage and faith, so too can we face the challenges in our own lives with the assurance that God will provide the strength and victory we need. The story of David and Goliath also teaches us about the importance of using the tools and gifts that God has given us. David did not rely on the conventional armor or weapons of war. Instead, he chose the simple tools of a shepherd, a sling, and a stone. In the same way, God equips each of us with unique gifts and abilities to face the challenges of life. We may not always have the resources or the qualifications that the world deems necessary, but when we trust in God's provision and use what He has given us, we can accomplish great things. Finally, the story of David and Goliath invites us to reflect on the power of humility and dependence on God. David's victory was not the result of his own strength or skill. It was the result of his complete trust in God. In our own lives, we are reminded that true strength comes not from ourselves, but from the Lord. When we humble ourselves before God and acknowledge our need for His guidance and strength, He is faithful to deliver us from our challenges. As the people of Israel celebrated David's victory, they also recognized the significance of the moment. It was not just a victory in battle, it was a victory of faith, a victory that demonstrated the power of God to overcome any obstacle. The defeat of Goliath would go down in history as one of the most memorable moments in the Bible, a moment that would inspire generations to come. And as you reflect on this story, think about the giants you may be facing in your own life. Perhaps you're battling fear, doubt, or obstacles that seem insurmountable. But remember, just like David, you are never alone. When you place your trust in God and rely on His strength, He will fight on your behalf, and you can overcome anything that stands in your way. Take a moment to pause, to reflect on how God has been faithful in your life, and how His power can help you face the giants that seem impossible to defeat. As we close today, I invite you to reflect on your own story of faith and courage, and perhaps share your favorite Bible stories with us in the comments below. Thank you for listening. We hope this story of David and Goliath has encouraged you, and we look forward to sharing more stories with you in the future.